Hi all, thanks for coming. So we are running a bit late and we are going to start in like 5-6 minutes.
Disappointed. Fantastic. Hello. Are you wanting to take? He did a fantastic job of it. Exactly. Oh, that's nice to meet you. I'm very yeah. Hey,
Hey.
yes. That would be great. Locals, please. So nice to meet you. Yeah, but it's original.
Okay.
Myself.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. We are pleased to welcome you all to this session on carbon pricing, which is a topic that's becoming increasingly central to conversations around climate policy, competitiveness, and economic growth. This session is jointly organized by the India Sustainable Growth Hub and the Climate Institute at Ahmedabad University. To begin the session, I would like to invite Chitra to briefly introduce the India Sustainable Growth Hub and introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Jonathan Colmer.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here for a post-lunch session. I'm Chitra Balasubramanian. I'm a senior economist with the India Sustainable Growth Hub. We are basically a collaboration between the Indian Statistical Institute at Delhi and the International Growth Center at the London School of Economics. And our research focuses on policies for sustainable growth, specifically around the new economic thinking on how India can build a low-carbon economy. There are three key ways that we engage in. First is research commissioning. We also convene researchers and policy stakeholders, and we're also building a community of practice that can provide rigorous and policy relevant evidence. Our leadership includes Professor Chetan Ghate and Professor E. Somnathan. They're both senior faculty at ISI Delhi, and they have deep expertise in a long-standing relationship with the Indian government. Just to give you a sense of the kind of events we've organized and how we've been engaging so far, in December this year, right before the ISI Economics Conference, we held our first flagship event, which is the India Sustainable Growth Hub Environment Day. And we brought together policymakers, academics, as well as key members of the civil society to engage in discussions around sustainable growth. So some of the research clusters that are emerging for us are carbon pricing pathways in India, reforms in the distribution sector, as well as macroeconomic implications of climate change. So in our attempt to build a domestic community of practice on low carbon development, this is our partnership with the Climate Institute, because we really want to engage with the Indian academics and Indian centers, research centers. So today's talk is part of that, and we have with us Jonathan Colmer. So Jonathan is an associate professor of economics and public policy in the Department of Econ at the University of Virginia. He's a co-founder and the director of the Environmental Inequality Lab. He's also a theme leader for the Climate and Environment Program at PEDL, which sits in the Center for Economic Performance, Economic Policy Research. He's an affiliate with us at IGC and also a research associate at the Center for Economic Performance. Today's keynote, which is titled The Global Incidence of Carbon Pricing from Theory to Evidence, will discuss carbon pricing in theory, what the empirical evidence shows so far, and what this implies as carbon pricing expands globally. So Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you, Chitra, and thank you for having me. It's great to be here. I've had a wonderful trip so far, and it was great to spend some time up in Delhi. And now the weather and the air quality is very great here. I'm having a wonderful time. So it's great to be here to talk to you about carbon pricing. And what a time to do it as well. The EU CBAM came into effect just 10 days ago on January 1st, 2026. And so it's nice to go from theory to practice a little bit. And I look forward to sort of talking with you all about sort of the implications. So just as a starting point, the way I got into this work really fundamentally came from, I think, a feeling as a graduate student and as an undergraduate, like that there are sort of two key policy challenges that we face in the 21st century. First and foremost, eradicating poverty and increasing living standards around the world, and especially in low middle income countries. But that sort of is, to me, economics is about how can we make people's lives better. And so I think first and foremost, that is the key idea. We weren't put on this planet to maximize income. We weren't put on this planet to save the planet, to save the environment. As you know, we're all utility maximizers. And so, the environment is a critical part of that, right? So, to me, the two key challenges then are, number one, how do we eliminate poverty, increase living standards? And then how do we confront climate change and the other environmental challenges that we face? And these are a fundamental tension with each other, right? Because on the one hand, we know the efforts to promote growth and development are critical to eliminating poverty, but they have traditionally and historically resulted from huge increases in resource use and energy, which has got us into the situation with climate change that we now face. And then at the same time, of course, climate change itself undermines this process of growth and development, both in terms of the damages that we face from climate change, but also in terms of the fact that policy to mitigate climate change is in itself costly. And so how we sort of think about the balance between the imperative need for growth and development and the externalities from growth, to me, is sort of my telos. It's my reason for being. It's why I get up in the morning. And I encourage you to continue to work on these problems too. So that's sort of the starting point here. Because with CBAM, that tension is very clear, right? So I think the part of the challenge and part of the reason it is so challenging is because we see a real composition in where mitigation is going to come from, right? High-income countries are responsible for emissions today, right? Full stop. They got us into this mess, and so the kind of cruel calculus of it all is that they're not going to get us out of it, even if they went to zero emissions today. So low and middle income countries are going to account for almost 100% of emissions growth going forward. They already account for 60% of emissions growth today. So while high income countries are, again, responsible for the aggregate, China, of course, is the sort of the highest emitter in terms of annual emissions. And so going forwards, most of those emissions are not going to come from the US and Europe, and even really China. They're going to come from sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, elsewhere. And some interesting work done by the Rhodium Group, which sort of are affiliated with the Climate Impact Lab at the University of Chicago and elsewhere, sort of shows that even if the OECD went to zero emissions today, overnight, 88% of emissions reductions and avoidances more so, avoidances is the real thing here, would need to come from low middle income countries to avoid 2 degrees of warming. So we got us into this mess. We can't get us out of this mess. And so it's going to be costly. And so in whatever model you run and whatever pathway you consider, it's costly. And so as economists, I think we have a real sort of opportunity and a comparative advantage maybe to sort of think through the different pathways and really as imperative as it is to grow and develop, it's also imperative to find the least cost paths to decoupling emissions from growth and to reducing emissions, because it's going to be expensive, whatever we do. And so we need research and evidence to try and chart a path which is least cost or as low cost as possible. So that's kind of the challenge. Now, economists disagree a lot. I don't know whether you've had this experience, but we're a little bit combative. Have a good argument. Shruti is nodding. She has to deal with us and deal with me. She's an economist as well. She can be combative, but it's good. This is what works as well. You get good ideas. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? One thing economists almost universally agree on, though, is that carbon pricing is the most cost-effective way to internalize the social costs of climate change. I think it was in 2017, 3,500 economists from many different walks of life, conservatives, liberals, from high-income countries, low-income countries, across the full distribution of whatever spectrum you want to think about, wrote a letter in the Wall Street Journal, basically making that statement. It was the largest public statement of economists saying carbon pricing is the way to go. We want a least cost path to internalizing the social cost of climate change. Carbon pricing is what we agree. The second largest statement by economists was written in 1997 after the Kyoto Protocol, advocating for carbon pricing as a least cost path to internalize the social cost of climate change. 25 economists back in 1997. So that's the one thing we all agree on, right? And the premise really is that we have this promise in theory that carbon pricing is the way to go. It minimizes the total compliance costs by letting regulated agents choose how to comply. There are sometimes some concerns that letting regulated agents choose how to comply can undermine the efficacy of policy. But that's something to understand. It's an empirical question. But it discourages the production of emissions-intensive goods. It encourages abatement and can incentivize innovation and technology adoption to result in sort of dynamic cost reductions over time as well. So this is what I think we all agree on, hopefully. There's been less evidence in practice, right? Carbon pricing is a relatively new thing. The ETS in Europe, the European Union Emissions Trading Scheme, was introduced in 2005. And so we've only really had good data to evaluate it for the last sort of couple of decades. Goodness, it's been 2 decades already. That time does fly. That's how long it takes to write papers in economics, I find sometimes as well, though. So we have good data now. We have emerging carbon markets globally. And so the empirical evidence to go from theory to empirics, to understand the sort of the margins of adjustment, the mechanisms through which firms respond to these prices, helps to give us better insights into the benefits in terms of the emissions reductions that we see, as well as the potential costs and how those are distributed, which is an important aspect of things as well. So in terms of the empirical evidence, I did say it takes 2 decades to write a paper. So my paper in the Review of Economic Studies, published finally in 2024, it took us 13 years to write it. It wasn't quite 2 decades, but what we basically find in this paper, using installation firm level data in France for the manufacturing sector, really fantastic administrative data, allowed us to sort of identify the effects that the ETS has had on regulated firms relative to unregulated firms over time. And we found that carbon pricing was quite effective in reducing emissions. One of the things that we really were able to get at was the different mechanisms and margins of adjustments that firms were making. We were able to see if they changed their energy mix, whether they adjusted trade in a way to sort of like try and undermine the policy through carbon leakage, by outsourcing production. We could see their investments in technology. We had interviews with managers of the firms to try and understand what they were doing. And it sort of helped us to understand a sort of rich picture of what firms were doing in this context, and found really that firms were investing in clean technologies, leading to these sort of permanent reductions in emissions intensity, such that economic cycles are going up and down, but sort of just the efficiency reduction in terms of emissions there, once you made that fixed cost investment, those emissions reductions in terms of production were lower. The surprising thing, though, if you speak to policymakers, if you speak to think tanks, there was a big concern, of course. Speak to firms especially. The big concern was that this was going to be devastating for the economy. Prices were going to be, output prices were going to go up, employment was going to go down. It was going to be sort of a crushing blow to the manufacturing sector that was already under stress already in sort of the globalized world that we live in. But across sort of the first 2 phases of the ETS, we found no evidence of negative economic effects. We didn't find any contractions in output. We didn't find any contractions in value added or in employment. We found increased investment. We didn't find any reductions in productivity either. And sort of what rationalized this, as we found from the interviews with managers and the investments that we saw, was that firms basically prior to the ETS, had no incentive to adopt new clean technologies. But facing a carbon price, they now had this choice between sort of paying a fixed cost versus having higher marginal costs, variable marginal costs. And for some of them, it made the sense to make that investment. And when you have firms, some of which are more emissions intensive and some which are less emissions intensive, this is now a new margin of adjustment. And so these firms became more emissions efficient, and then they benefited from that. And so in terms of the average rate, there's some distributional things going on within regulated firms, changes in market share from more intensive versus to less intensive producers. But pricing carbon did the thing that we wanted it to do, which is to sort of steer activity towards more efficient, less carbon intensive activities. So this sort of absence of negative economic consequences is actually a pretty broadly robust finding in the literature now we see. But it happening through this process of investments in clean technology, which are still costly. This isn't to say it was costless. It's just that there were some benefits as well that firms hadn't fully internalized because it wasn't worth it absent this price signal. So yeah, we like prices. Markets are great. The other thing that's kind of shown up is it's not just in the micro data that we see, in the aggregate data. So this is the European Union, and we see that total emissions have gone down over time. There was a recession, there was COVID, but overwhelmingly, industrial production during this period has not only sort of remained flat, it has continued to grow. Industrial production, right? So this is under regulation, not contractions, not disaster, expansion with fewer emissions. And there's been some really interesting work by Ivan Ruddick and co-authors that I was discussing last week in America at the American Economic Association conference, where they basically make this point more cleanly, where when you have heterogeneous firms, where there's variation in your emissions intensity, marginal abatement costs look very steep for the individual firm, but at the industry level, it's a lot flatter. This is a good view for me. It's not so much a good view for you, so flatter that way. But basically, you can have this sort of between firm reallocation within sectors, so that the really emissions intensive firms just sort of lose market share to the more emissions intensive, well, less emissions intensive firms. And that means that the cost of complying with the policy is a lot lower. It sucks if you're a high emissions intensity firm in the sector because you're losing out, but the economy as a whole, the aggregate economy, is not experiencing those costs in the same way. And so price effects are going to be muted, employment costs are going to be muted, so on and so forth. And this is again, like something that as economists, it's not obvious to see in the data necessarily straight off the bat, but like when we think about things, we have mental models of the world, we think about unintended consequences. These more general equilibrium responses are critical to understanding environmental regulation. So the question with CBAM really becomes one of, well, what happens when we go global, right? So in 2025, as I said, there's been a big increase in carbon pricing globally, either through carbon taxes or emissions trading scheme. China's emissions trading scheme now is the largest one globally. We thought we had it down in the EU, but there's more people in China, so that helps a bit, sort of stacks the deck a little bit, I'd say. But good news, got carbon pricing increasing. Or being planned or being under consideration. In 2026, countries affected by carbon pricing went global, right? And this is because of the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism. And just to sort of give you the 101 on CBAM, right? What does it do? So within Europe, you're a firm, right? You face the carbon price in the EU, let's call it 90 euros, right? Firms don't like this, right? Because they don't want to be taxed. But prior to CBAM, they really didn't like it because firms outside of the EU weren't taxed. And they were like, this isn't fair. Why do we have to pay the tax and no one else, right? That's the case with unilateral climate policies in a globally integrated world, right? Or globally integrated production. Now, with CBAM, you should think of it as effectively a carbon tariff, to be somewhat colloquial. So what happens now is that within the 6 sectors that are currently regulated, and I expect that more will be regulated over time, you send steel to the EU, then you face the carbon price at the border. So if you have no carbon price, and the carbon price at the EU border is 90 euros, you have to pay the 90 euro per ton of CO2 that is embedded in production. And so that means that the firms in the EU are happy, or happier, let's say, whereby, you know, they are now on the same, is leveling the playing field in terms of global competitiveness, because their competitors pay the tax that imports into the EU and elsewhere, right? It helps to mitigate carbon leakage, because whereas previously these EU firms could have outsourced production to another unregulated market and then import it back in, the incentive to do that now is completely gone, because why would I outsource something, import it in and pay the tax? That's a far more costly way of doing things. And the other thing that it does, which is interesting when you think through the theory of it, is that it crowds in carbon pricing in unregulated markets. And the reason is because your firms now, so firms in India, are paying the carbon price. So producer surplus is down. It's not a choice between no tax versus tax, which is usually the political economy conflict that one faces when trying to set up a tax, because firms don't want it and they're going to argue against it. Firms are paying it. Like, India does not have a policy lever that can reduce the tax that Indian firms face. But India has a choice in terms of whether it taxes carbon domestically and keeps the money at home, or sends the money to the EU. It's just not everywhere in the world now has this choice, right? Because producer surplus has gone down. It's not a choice of tax versus no tax. It's a choice between, do you keep the money here or do you send it overseas? And so that's what happens. That's the little red dot there. If you have a 10 euros tax, you don't pay the 90 ton at the border, you pay 80 tons, the difference. So if you have a 90 euro tax, it's equalized. And so the kind of implications of CBAM is that we expect that, and this has been sort of conversations that co-authors have been having with policymakers around the world, is that there is increasing interest and even fast tracking of emissions trading schemes and carbon pricing now, such that the money doesn't get sent to the EU, it stays here, and it sort of helps to equalize those things. So we wanted to do an analysis of this. We wanted to get sort of an understanding of the consequences of CBAM. And so, and especially in terms of the distributional implications. So the goal is to realign incentives. As I said, you improve domestic competitiveness in the EU because you're making it a level playing field in that way. You make it a level playing field in terms of carbon leakage. You can't carbon leak anymore. Like, just you pay the tax when it comes back in. And then it encourages carbon taxation abroad. But the big concern that people have had, and this is largely because the implicit assumption is productivity and carbon emissions intensity is very strongly correlated inversely. So if you're very productive, you'll have a low emissions intensity of production. If you're not very productive, then you'll have a high emissions intensity of production. The concern is that CBAMs may disproportionately affect low and middle income countries if that assumption is true. Right? If it's the case that low and middle income countries are more emissions intensive in production than high income countries, then the incidence, the burden of CBAM is going to fall disproportionately on low and middle income countries. But that is an empirical question, right? This is why we need data. This is why we need evidence. We wanted to try and understand whether this was the case or not. So in work with Alan Shao, Kim Klausing, and Catherine Wolfram, we managed to get data on the near universe of aluminium plants and steel plants globally. And so what this data here is just showing is cumulative capacity around the world against production costs to give us sort of production cost curves, which allows us to then sort of add through an equilibrium model the carbon tax associated with CBAM to see how that shifts production. Production costs are going to go up, but they're going to go, if it's the case that the most productive firms are the least emissions intensive, all you're going to see is a level shift. But if it's the case that that correlation is not 1-to-1 or negative 1-to-1, then you're going to see shifts in rank within this distribution. And low emissions intensity firms are going to benefit. High emission intensity firms are going to be disproportionately affected by this. And so in this situation, CBAM has this sort of implication where there could be a new margin of comparative advantage through trade, not just productivity, but emissions intensity as well. And what we see is across the world, the relationship between emissions intensity and income is basically flat. There's no statistically significant relationship between the emissions intensity of production and GDP per capita. We can control for production structure, state-owned enterprises, the type of technology that is being used. There's sort of two main technologies within steel and aluminum. One is cleaner than the other. But there's no smoking gun, so to speak, to suggest that the emissions intensity of production in low and middle income countries is substantially higher than in high income countries. And so in that respect, at a first blush sort of look at the data, it would suggest that our priors move slightly from CBAM to being regressive to CBAM being income neutral. Okay. So this is just in the data. We don't see a relationship there. We wanted to then understand how that looked through the lens of the model. What would be the effect of CBAM? Because this was pre-CBAM, this was in 2023. We wanted to simulate the effects of CBAM itself to see how that affected different countries and firms. So as I said, this is controlling for different from production. CBAM generates this green premium that I was mentioning. If you are in a low-income country, but you are not emissions intensive, that is a competitive advantage. If countries in low and middle income countries can become less emissions intensive, that is a competitive advantage. And so in an increasingly carbon price world, it's no longer labor costs and productivity that are really driving things. They're still there, of course, but there is this new margin that one can compete over, which is the emissions intensity of production. So that's the key. So emissions are not systematically higher in low-income countries. That's sort of stylized fact of the paper. For the aluminium and steel sector, I should be clear. Other sectors we don't have good data on. We need to do more to understand those. But for these two sectors, which account for 14% of global emissions and are the industrial sectors where decarbonization we think is most difficult. So they're both. So we then sort of consider a model of environmental regulation with global trade. And it's a very simple model. It's very stylized, which allows us to get sort of a long way. The carbon tax comes into effect in the regulated market. There's none in the unregulated market. That's the ETS story I've been telling you up until now, was true up until January 1st of this year, right? And without a CBAM, only the regulated firms pay the tax. This makes them less competitive. It leads to leakage and free riding, right? That's the story. What CBAM does is it pushes sales to the unregulated market. It results in, we go from a common world price to now there being a wedge. The tariff at the border, so to speak, means that there's the regulated price, which has gone up, and then the unregulated price, which has now gone down because supply is shifted into there, and that sort of results in this sort of glut of surplus. So what this does is to make domestic firms more competitive, right? Leveling of the playing field. It reduces leakage because there's no incentive to do that. And then it creates this fiscal incentive to raise government revenue by increasing carbon pricing in unregulated market and making that unregulated market smaller and smaller. Right? As the regulated market grows, the price of aluminium and steel in the unregulated market is going to go down and down, right? Because there's just going to be sort of less supply. But the incidence requires the data. So we can't just write a theory. That's the theory in a nutshell. But it doesn't tell you what the incidence is without the data. So what we do is we sort of estimate demand and supply elasticities from the data and simulate the European carbon tax of $100 per ton. We then consider the with versus without CBAM analysis to isolate the marginal impact of CBAM and then evaluate welfare relative to zero regulation. So what we do, and what we find in the data is that CBAM boosts competitiveness. Sorry, just going to get some water. So as expected, and as one would imagine, without CBAM, the regulated firms lose out and the unregulated firms gain because of sort of increased market share. There's a single price without CBAM. So the emissions tax goes in effect, the price goes up. That's great in unregulated markets. The price is higher now. You are facing costs in the unregulated market. But with CBAM, we see for Europe, the cost of the policy is a lot lower. There's no sort of benefits of this in here. Everything I'm going to show you is on the fiscal cost side. So you could sort of think about social cost of carbon being sort of positive, hopefully, right? And then that would sort of, it doesn't make any sense for Europe to do this unless they believe the social cost of carbon is positive, right? Because otherwise they're just introducing a distortion and losing out for no reason, right? But they think there is, and so there's a benefit here. So CBAM comes into effect. emissions producer surplus is still negative in Europe, but it's less negative. But producer surplus in China and the rest of the world also goes down because of this reallocation. In terms of leakage, we see the emissions with CBAM versus without CBAM. In a global sense, you see a much larger reduction in global emissions because this relocation option of leakage is much less. We see about a 30% reduction in carbon leakage. And then the other thing, just to sort of show you that there is a sort of policy crowd-out incentive, is that we consider China as a sort of an alternative policy situation where they could introduce a carbon price. They've already got the ETS, so this is just sort of an expansion there. But we start with China being unregulated, and then we simulate what would happen if China also introduced a carbon price of $100 as well, similar to the Europe. And China is huge. It's about 50% of the market in both steel and aluminum. So in the European Union, like the CBAM is the effects are small, right? Because it's a small player in the grand scheme of things. But when you start regulating China, the emission reductions go from what? It was 18 tons with no CBAM in China either, to global emission reductions from 18 to 322 megatons reductions with China, okay? So at an average cost of 61 sort of dollars per ton. Now, when Europe introduces CBAM, what happens now is that in the China case, if China doesn't have its own CBAM, think about it as like a sort of carbon exchange rate, so to speak, then emissions, the cost to China goes up to $62 per ton. But if China itself introduces its own CBAM, then China actually benefits. Abatement is $3 cheaper for China with a Europe-China CBAM like cooperation. And so increasing the sort of the coalition, so to speak, if you want to think about it in a sort of Nordhaus Climate Club way, actually reduces the abatement costs of mitigation. So China is better off if it introduces its CBAM than if it doesn't. When we sort of look at the CBAM versus non-CBAM consumer surplus and producer surplus, similar to sort of the micro plant level data that I showed you previously, the impacts of CBAM is relatively flat throughout the income distribution, right? So this goes strongly against the prior of the policy think tanks and sort of discussion that's been going on previously from the World Bank. Right? Again, we need to think about general equilibrium effects. We need to sort of think about the underlying microdata. In terms of the winners and losers, so in terms of consumer surplus, the biggest winners are China, again, huge economy, huge market in this setting. The US, India does very well in consumer surplus, but it is completely offset by reductions in producer surplus. Right? India is a little bit of an outlier in this case because it's a slightly more emissions intensive. The curve is like the best fit is flat, but there are people above and below, right? And so whilst it's the case that in general, the relationship is flat, India is on the slightly more emissions intensive side of things within the set of low and middle income countries. And so it does sort of experience this sort of larger reduction in producer surplus. China, order of magnitude higher in terms of reductions in producer surplus. The gains in producer surplus are within the EU, as one would expect. So consumer surplus also reductions within the EU, like consumers are worse off under CBAM, under the ETS as well, because prices have gone up, right? Again, because we think it's worth it because of the social cost of carbon not being zero, otherwise it's just a distortion. So I think I'm actually ahead of time. This is good. So just to sort of take a pause and to summarize, like we use a quantitative equilibrium analysis of the European CBAM policies. We find in theory and empirically that it boosts competitiveness, curbs leakage, and encourages regulation. Conversations with policymakers also seem to be going in a way that it's encouraging regulation. Vietnam, for example, is fast-tracking its ETS in order to sort of keep money at home. This project started from a conversation with IGC in Mozambique, where Mozambique, which exports 97% of aluminum to the EU, wanted to understand the implications and is now like, oh, cool, this is good for us because it turns out we're actually relatively low emissions intensity in terms of our aluminum. We're a winner in this sense. There are some, it's not just relative winners, there are some actual absolute winners. Some people are actually better off under CBAM than not under CBAM because of this pricing of carbon. So that notwithstanding, there are also losers, right? Of course, like it's not it's distributionally neutral on average, but there are winners and losers in a global sense. It's distributionally neutral. Investments to reduce emissions has led to emissions intensity has led to increased global competitiveness. And this other fact, which I think is particularly interesting from sort of just a development finance perspective, like carbon pricing is relatively low in terms of administrative cost relative to other forms of taxation. And because you don't face the political constraint under CBAM to sort of battle with firms about the tax versus no tax situation, there is a sort of opportunity almost to increase fiscal capacity by pricing carbon domestically. So what do we need? Just to sort of leave you with some things to think about. I think that going forwards, it's really important to do sort of more detailed country-specific analysis to identify opportunities and constraints associated with decoupling emissions from growth. In our analysis, we hold the emissions intensity of production fixed because it's a short-run, medium-run analysis. We do some analysis later in the paper to sort of think about, well, what if we allowed to expand capacity and result in investments in clean technologies to reduce the emissions intensity of production further. That almost mechanically reduces marginal abatement costs further because we're sort of stacking it to do that. But of course, going forwards, what countries do and what firms do are going to affect their incidence of CBAM. Countries and firms that make investments in low carbon technologies and identify low carbon opportunities are going to become more competitive in an increasingly carbon price world, and those that don't are going to become less competitive. And so this is not sort of QED, right? This does not the Lucas critique holds, right? What happens going forward is going to depend on the choices of agents and decision makers. And so I think understanding and searching for opportunities for low carbon investments that are cost effective and that make sense within an understanding of the policy environment is critical. And how we do that, I think, is through a need for rigorous data-driven evidence, as well as consideration of general equilibrium effects. In partial equilibrium, speak to the firm that has high emissions intensity, that doesn't like this policy. They're going to be very loud. They think it's terrible. They're going to tell you it's disastrous for the economy. It's disastrous for them in partial equilibrium. But there are other players and other people that matter too. And so understanding the sort of the aggregate from micro to macro is also important. And I think it's helpful for policymakers to hear that as well, because it's a nuanced argument. It's a nuanced point. And we need to be effective in communicating these things as well and thinking through both the intended and the unintended consequences. And that's what we do so well as economists. So I encourage you all to continue this work. And thank you for the opportunity to speak with you again today.
We have a bit of time for a few questions, and then we can take on the rest of the questions in the panel, please.
Hi, I'm Sangeeta Bansal from JNU. So thank you for a very interesting, putting out the scenario of welfare analysis of CBAM. So I'm just thinking that your premise is based on the assumption that countries other than EU, they have only two options, whether to pay carbon taxes to EU or, or domestically have carbon tax. But there could be an alternative scenario where they diversify and maybe change the trading partners. So, I mean, is that scenario also included here?
Yes, so that is exactly the type of general equilibrium effect that we consider. It's not that people are forced to trade to the EU still, but what the CBAM does means that the price within the EU is higher and the price outside of the EU is lower. So a firm is making a choice as to where to send their steel or aluminum, given their costs, given the tax that they now face. If they are at low emissions intensity, like their marginal costs go up by less than the tax. And so it makes sense for them to take advantage of the higher price in the EU because their revenues go up by more. But if they are high emissions intensity, they trade outside of the EU. And now with CBAM, they get a lower price. And so they're worse off. That's why the producer surplus falls because the price in the outside of the EU goes down. We go from a sort of a common price globally to now this sort of two-tier system. So they don't have to adopt carbon pricing. They don't have to trade with the EU anymore. But by not trading with the EU, you get surplus increases. It shifts production to the unregulated markets, and the price goes down in those markets, which means that producer surplus for those firms fall.
Thank you for the presentation. It was very, very insightful. But one of the concerns with social cost of carbon is that there is an issue of stranded asset when we try to imply any kind of carbon taxes or anything like that on the to reduce the emission. So does going global with CBAM, will that really help with that course of action? In the sense that will it also result into stranded asset in the unregulated markets because of CBAM?
Yeah. So I think the stranded asset problem is obviously like a really important one to engage with. The analysis that we're doing here is sort of what I would describe as short to medium run, rather than sort of long run where sort of those types of questions may become more pertinent. I think that in the long run, there are these questions of like, how large is the unregulated market? How is that going to evolve over time? That's going to shape the stranded asset type questions. It's also going to depend on sort of the technologies and how that evolves in terms of abatement costs and sort of the opportunities there as well.
So thank you for the great analysis. My question is that, first of all, CBAM is seen as a trade barrier. You go to other countries who are actually supplying to EU, they see the CBAM measures as trade barrier. So first of all, yeah.
I did your question, sorry.
So the CBAM is actually, like, there were a lot of reports in the newspaper also. Industries are seeing this policy as a trade barrier, not an enabler. So coming to the point that whether it is going to increase inequality also or not, because if countries like China, India, who are supplying to EU, the first mover advantage will go to the countries who have like a lot of capital to invest. Suppose you're talking about steel. So there is a lot of discussion on green steel. In green steel, blast furnace is the most appropriate technology, but at the same time, like who has the capability to invest in green hydrogen? So again, what I'm trying to say is that it will also increase the inequalities. And then coming to the sectors, all the 6 sectors you are talking about, is EU the net exporter or importer for those sectors? Whether it is going to only encourage or increase the price differentiation for the EU companies and from the outside. And as you shown in the example, like $10, where is the $10 going? Really, we are talking about a world where we are going to shift this $10 for technology transfer or climate finance. Is it going to happen or not? Few questions.
So obviously on the climate finance question, we could have several hours of discussion on that. So I'm not going to throw myself into the details of that right now. But yeah, what one does with the money is obviously an important question. In terms of the trade barriers, right? So yeah, like I described it as sort of a carbon tariff. That is effectively what it does in practice. I think that the questions and the concerns you're raising are inherently dynamic. They're about sort of what's going to happen next. I think that what I would say is that we're starting from a position of it looking income neutral, right? The distribution of emissions intensity across countries is not tied to productivity in the way that we might have believed previously. What happens next? I don't know. We've done analysis to think about sort of changes in emissions technology. It's going to depend on how those investments are distributed and what the incentives are to make those investments. That's sort of a much more micro type question to explore. But I 100% agree that sort of innovation and diffusion of technology is going to be a sort of a really critical thing for sort of being able to take advantage of the potential opportunities that sort of CBAM is going to create for low emissions intensity producers and future low emissions intensity producers. Whether that exacerbates or dampens inequality going forwards is an empirical question which we should really explore, right? We collectively. So yeah, I agree. That's a really important question.
Let's hold on to those questions and ask them during the panel discussions.
Thank you for your questions.
So, yeah, so thank you very much, Professor Colmer, for sharing such meaningful insights from your work and setting a strong foundation for the discussion ahead. We'll now take a short tea break just outside. When we come back, we'll continue this conversation with a panel discussion that brings perspective from economics, policy, and research in the context of India's evolving carbon price landscape. So thank you again, and tea is just outside.
Thank you.